So welcome everyone. Hi, my name is Gabrielle and I work at Maribyrnong Libraries in Melbourne's Inner West. We're thrilled to have you joining us for this Global Learning Festival event, a Climate Proof Your Garden Sustainability Workshop by Ella from Chooktopia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am joining from today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which you are all joining from today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. If you would like to type in the chat box, you can also share where you are joining from today. First Nations Australians are the oldest continuing living culture in the world. Today, as we learn about sustainable gardening and climate change, I reflect that First Nations people in Australia have been caring for country for at least 60,000 years. I'm so excited to introduce Ella, the founder of Chooktopia. Chooktopia is about grassroots sustainability, being in touch with earth, nature, and the source of your food. This relaxed and fun workshop run by Ella will help you become inspired about closed-loop gardening, improve food security, and make your garden become part of the climate solution. Some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions for Ella, you can type these in the chat. We will also share an event survey in the chat later on and would love if you could complete the survey for us. Please keep your microphone on mute. We will be recording today's session, so if you would prefer to be not on the screen, you can turn your camera off. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Ella. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. There's so much that we can talk about with sustainability and with climate and gardening. So hopefully this gives you a nice high-level overview and a snapshot, and I guess a bit of inspiration to then take some of these ideas and research them further to apply some of them as some projects in your garden over summer. So we'll look firstly at climate change, what's actually the issue with climate change in relation to our gardens and food security, of course. And then we're going to look at sort of mitigation versus adaptation and production and protection and how all these things fit together. How can we balance priorities, basically? Then we'll look at lots of different design ideas for resilience. So resilience against a lot of the impacts that we see of climate change, whether it's flood or temperature, all sorts of things. We will touch on plant selection, but again, I could spend a whole nother hour on that, so it'll be very high level, as will closed loop gardening. So questions, as you've been advised, questions can go in the chat box. If they're topical at the time for clarification of what I'm talking about, we can address them at the time, but otherwise we'll come back to them all at the end. So what's actually the issue with climate change? Well, on a global scale, it's the whole destabilization, it's the changing of the ocean currents and acidification and how they then affect weather patterns and storms and extremes that then bring us heat waves and drought and floods and all sorts of other issues, which of course lead to lower rainfall in some areas, higher in other, higher volumes, crop failures and pressure on the food system. So again, inspiring us to have a bit of that resilience at home. Of course, the impact on wildlife and extinction, which is a key driver for me, is really to care for the wildlife. And there's so much unknown in terms of El Nino and La Nina, and it looks like we're going to have a very cool wet summer again this year, which is very strange, and that's because of a La Nina influence, but we just don't know how El Nino and La Nina actually interact with climate change, because the human race has never seen the climate change that we're experiencing now. So many unknowns. So translating that back to some of our local issues in the garden, you may have already noticed some of these things like the shifting pollination impacts. So if you've got, I hear about tomatoes that are still going strong midwinter, which is just so strange because normally you wouldn't get tomatoes in winter. So things are shifting, things are flowering at different times, longer, shorter, later, earlier, fruits coming at different times. And when you've got generation after generation of key pollinators like insects and bats that have been set, they've evolved to pollinate at a certain time. If that shifts, it can just throw the ecosystem into chaos. So that then affects breeding cycles and, of course, food security, because we need pollinators to pollinate our food. And then, of course, there's the local impacts that I'm sure we've all felt in really hot summers with drought and heat waves. Drought's in there twice, that's a typo, but probably a bit of an omen as well to a point. And of course, deluge, which we've all experienced just last week, flash flooding. And then, of course, fire. So it's not, climate change isn't just a warmer, hotter world. It's erratic and it's extremes, and it has impacts on wildlife, and it has impacts on, pardon me, on our food system. So hopefully that all sounds very doomy and gloomy, and I don't intend it to sound doomy and gloomy. I just want to give you the context so that you can get a bit inspired to take, take some of these actions. So we're going to look at mitigation and adaptation versus production and protection. So to define that, mitigation, when we talk about climate change, we talk about mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change. I've always been very passionate about mitigating climate change. So trying to prevent it, trying to reduce the impacts, trying to get trees in the ground, sequester the carbon, do everything we can to reduce the amount of climate change that we're having. Whereas another school of thought is it's too late, we need to just adapt. Really, we need to do both at the same time, because we're already seeing extremes. We already need to start adapting to those extremes. We need to have gardens that can withstand the deluge, withstand the drought, potentially withstand fire, and all these other impacts. So balancing mitigation and adaptation at once is really important. So creating green spaces is really good for mitigation, but creating green spaces also gives us a refuge, because green spaces help prevent flooding and help prevent heat waves. So it's really about getting that balance and working them hand in hand. And then production and protection, you'll see I've kind of linked the colours here. So adaptation and production are very human oriented. How are we going to adapt to climate change, and how are we going to make sure we've still got enough food and be resilient to the impacts, and still have a functional garden that we can enjoy. Whereas protection is sort of more with mitigation. It's about protecting the environment, helping to support the environment. So helping those local systems still be a little bit self-sustaining. And supporting wildlife. So, but of course, there's benefits for us in protecting the environment and having a balance. So what we want to have in our garden is a balance of production and protection. We want a productive food garden for food, but we don't want to do that at the expense of habitat for wildlife, because if we lose all our wildlife, the ecosystem collapses anyway. So it's about getting that balance. It's really important to feature both in our garden in terms of environmental protection and habitat and wildlife, as well as growing some food and closing the loop. So sounds really overwhelming, but it's really about just looking at those competing priorities and finding some sort of a happy medium, not just going, wholeheartedly one way at the expense of something else. And lots of little icons in here just as talking points. I suppose if we had more time, we could talk about that. But humans, are still one of these animals that we treat with when we're talking about habitat and right to life and everything else. We want to make sure that our children and our grandchildren, can actually have a pleasant life, a sustainable future. So we want to obviously care for them as well as for other animals. So in terms of balancing production and protection, we'll run through these in a bit more detail, and that is, in terms of protection, we'll be looking at our resilience and urban heat island effect and habitat. So using sort of smart design to, create an environment where we can be protected from the extremes and where wildlife can be protected from the extremes. And in terms of production, we'll touch on food, cultivation, livability, and all that sort of thing. So having a productive garden that's still usable, not turning every urban environment into a bush block. That would be really nice, but hard to grow food on a bush block. So it's about getting that balance. And so now we'll look through these in order of heat wave, fire, drought, etc., and give you some really good tips on how it all goes together. So our aim with heat waves, drought, and fire, obviously we try to reduce them, but we want to be resilient to them. So I'm going to talk about urban heat island effects and heat waves. What you get in an urban environment is a much hotter environment than you get in a rural environment, and that's because of all the concrete and hard surfaces. So we want to think about how we can make our garden resilient through green, permeable, soft surfaces, which are also potentially very fire resistant if you choose the right plants. They're drought resilient because plants create their own kind of natural water cycle within your garden. And of course, we want to bring in diversity. You don't want all your eggs in one basket and just have a garden that's completely full of lettuces or tomatoes. We want diversity of plants and species and insects and animals and birds, because that's where resilience comes from. It comes from diversity. So to explain urban heat island effect, as I mentioned, those hard surfaces, the concrete, the bricks, you think of a city environment. If you go into Melbourne CBD on a really hot day and you stay there, you have dinner. Oh, isn't this nice? After lockdown's opening, you can stay in Melbourne and have dinner, go to a show, and you'll come out at 11 o'clock at night and it'll still be stinking hot because all that heat is radiating off those black roads and all these hard surfaces. So cities really trap heat. It's called a heat island. And what you get out, the further you get out from the city, the more trees you have, the more green space you have. These areas cool down because there's less of those hard surfaces that absorb the heat during the day and then release them at night. And there's more of the green stuff, the trees, the plants, things that evapotranspirate. And evapotranspirate is what evaporative cooling is based on. It's that gently releasing of the moisture into the air, which has a cooling effect on the area around. So the more green we can get around our houses, the more resilient we'll be because the temperature will drop at night during heat waves. So here is a infrared photo where you can see all those roads, how red and dark and how much heat they're absorbing. So red is heat absorbed and the blue, it almost looks black probably depending on your screen, but the greeny blue colour, they're little patches of grass. They don't absorb the heat in the same way. If you are barefoot on a really hot day, you can step on the lawn, but you can't step on the path beside it. It will burn your foot. So exactly that same concept, but obviously on a much larger scale. And then this is an infrared photo taken from street level where you can see the things that don't absorb the heat or that cool down quickly. And as you can see, the trees there are particularly good at not absorbing the heat and at cooling down quickly. Excuse me. And the road, of course, is very hot. So this is just a diagram that explains that in a bit more detail, but we will revisit this type of diagram when we also look at water. The way that water moves through the environment also has a significant impact on those big rain events like we saw the other day, as well as the heat absorption, retention, and cooling. So what we call it when we create one of these small areas around our place that doesn't hold the heat and cools down is a microclimate. What you might have in a garden, or what you might have seen in a garden, is on the south side of the house, someone might have a fernery and you get moss growing in that fernery, and it's a nice cool, almost damp spot. Even on a hot day, it feels really cool. That's a microclimate. Conversely, on the north side of the house where you get direct sun, you might have, grass trees or a veggie patch or something that's a lot more exposed. But on a really hot day, you'll go out there and it'll be hot. So these are microclimates within our own yard. Those microclimates can become refuges. So if it's 40 or heaven forbid, 45 degrees, I can tell you that I would certainly be sitting in the fernery and not sitting in the veggie patch. So it's about creating these refuges. But the beautiful thing of these refuges is to have a refuge from the heat, we need green space, we need plants. And what do plants do? They grab carbon out of the atmosphere and store them. So they're mitigating whilst helping us adapt. They also retain moisture. So whilst your veggie patch on the north in full sun will dry out incredibly quickly and you'll need to keep mulching it and watering it, these refuges, these microclimates that are very moist and shady, they hold that moisture as the very nature of that small miniature ecosystem that you've created, that microclimate. But what else they do is create biological stepping stones. So as wildlife is displaced, or you think of bats. Bats are incredible pollinators, probably more so than bees. And butterflies and possums and lizards and all these animals that are constantly getting displaced from human activity. When we then get these wild weather events of extreme heat, extreme rain, extreme wind, these little microclimates create biological stepping stones. So animals can move and take cover, retreat in one of these before they then move on to the next and move on to the next. So they help connect bits of the environment as habitat, as well as creating us special little refuges. So what you want to do when you're creating your microclimate or your refuge in your garden is think about functionality and fit for purpose. So, you might want to put a path through there or a chair, or, you might want to set up your barbecue in that area, but you might find it gets mozzies and you want your barbecue elsewhere. So just think about in terms of your design, still make it fit for purpose, because if you create a microclimate that's then really unpleasant to sit in, you're not going to use it. So, you're going to put in the effort to creating creating a microclimate. You want to enjoy it yourself. It's not just for wildlife, it's for you as well. Utilize water if you can and permeable surfaces. So perhaps rather than putting in a solid concrete path, maybe put in some crazy pavers with, native creepers like native violet all growing in between rather than a solid concrete path, for example. But shade is definitely your friend, and so you're wanting to choose your really shady plants in one of these little microclimates. And think about evapotranspiration and cross breeze and natural cooling. If the area is completely enclosed by brick walls and you've then gone and put a pergola roof over the top, you're not going to get the cross breeze, so you're only going to get part of the benefit. So think about air movement as well as your layout and the materials and surfaces that you choose. And of course, take advantage of vertical spaces like your fence, whether you're growing a vine up a fence or putting, one of those great vertical gardens on a fence or anything like that. Like, use borrowed space, use height, and all that sort of thing. I love grapevines for that type of thing, because grapevines are create a beautiful microclimate in summer, but of course drop their leaves in winter and give you a nice little sunny spot as well. So really you want to create a little retreat. So here's just an example of, very straightforward, low cost little change. On the left here, you can see they've just put up some mesh or reinforced like Rio and grown a vine up there, which actually looks like an edible vine, to be honest. So that's ticking another box, growing something edible. Having that versus just an area out in the open where the only sort of bit of green space you've got is that lemon tree. I think it's a lemon tree. And you could just imagine how hot it would be on a 40-degree day sitting out at the table at the one on the right versus sitting on the chairs in the one on the left. So the more green you have, it really helps, not just with the air temperature, but also the air quality. If that air feels a bit moister, and then as the breeze blows, it's going to feel a lot cooler. So following on with that passive shading and cooling, a simple principle is just knowing obviously the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but in summer it's really high in the sky above us, and in winter it sits quite low. So it's sort of, in winter, hopefully you can see my video as well, it kind of goes around like that almost, whereas in summer it goes ooh, over the top. So you can actually plan your placement of shade, whether that's shade by pergola, shade by plants, to take advantage of the winter sun but block out the summer sun. And that's called passive shading and cooling. And as I mentioned before with the grapevine, you can see in the two pictures on the right here with that would be a, oh, not jasmine, I've gone blank. Got one sitting at the front door. Anyway, I'm sure you all know the know the vine that's there. They smell incredible. Wisteria, wisteria. So something like wisteria, where you get that beautiful shade in summer, but drops all its leaves in winter, so you get the benefit. And I love the picture above it. I just love that you don't have to go and use milled timber from a, illegally logged rainforest. You can use old stick. There's so much fallen timber at the moment after the big storms that I'm actually creating garden edging with all the fallen trees and logs and branches. But I love that it's been used in a pergola here. So you can get really creative. You don't have to go out to the local hardware store and buy questionable materials. Have a look around your garden, have a look at the tip shop and see what you can use to actually create a shade structure. And of course, if you've got no eaves or anything, you can pop in a blind, but better still, can you pop in some sort of natural shading where you can grow plants? The picture in the middle I really love, because I've seen this done with bed heads. In fact, I've tried to do it with a bed head, where you put bed heads sort of as a fence and grow your vines up the bed head, and that just gives you, as the breeze goes through it, it just gives you some more natural cooling. And just looking at the picture on the left versus the middle and on the right, do you feel like the one on the left just kind of feels hot? So there's a lot of amazing research being done on the psychology of colors, and that green, the psychology of green has a very cooling effect. So it's a bit of, I guess, a bit of a placebo as well, and that mind over matter. You feel cooler in a green space than you do surrounded by a brick wall. So again, just, even if you're renting, there are so many things that you can do to have, these shade structures and things. So whether that's, some of these are sort of more permanent. You can espalier if you don't have much space, espalier your fruit tree along a brick wall, for example, and that stops that wall absorbing too much heat, because eventually, obviously, that tree would cover most of the wall. Um, and you can put an old screen door in a tub on wheels that you can move around the house, and if you're renting, take it with you to the next house. So there's so much that you can do. It's about taking that concept and adapting it to suit your house. Whether if you're on a balcony, for example, like if you don't have a garden, you have a balcony, you could do something amazing on wheels with a screen that you could move around at different times of the year. It's just a little example here. I wouldn't recommend using a flimsy clothing rack, but just giving you that concept of having you can make something that's portable that still does the job. Or, of course, something permanent like using the vines. And even just utilizing your fences with vines. I would just recommend being, the greenie in me says, try not to use something weedy. So I would avoid outdoors, I would avoid things like English ivy and devil's ivy, anything that's going to actually damage bushland, because birds will eat the berries and then put them elsewhere, and it can be a real issue. So use something like grapes that aren't weedy, and you can eat them, like double benefit, or maybe a native vine if you don't need to collect the food as well. But yeah, just have a think about what you can do up some of those vertical spaces just to, I guess, filter some of that direct sun. And even indoors, like this is just an example on the right of a lovely little benchtop plant arrangement that just helps filter that light and the sun as it comes through the window, and it still has a cooling effect, both physically and psychologically. And just, can use all sorts of materials. So this is just wire and some timber struts. And speaking of those, using the green, so using the vegetation as much as possible, pardon me, is Obviously, those green spaces between the pavers, one, they're very cooling, so there's little refuges for lizards and ladybugs and all sorts of things. It's not just a stark open surface. Um, it has that localized, it's almost like a microclimate around each paver, which helps keeps the pavers a bit cool. Obviously, choosing a light coloured paver, so like a cream rather than a black paver, is going to help. On the left here, still better than a solid path where you've got the gravel and the pavers. These are going to be particularly good too, though, when you get deluge, because whilst they're cooler than a solid surface, because they hold moisture in them and because there's vegetation, they're also going to drain better. So when you do have deluge, you're going to have some water penetrate into the soil rather than just run off, which is why we have so much flash flooding in urban environments, because the water has to go somewhere, and when it can't sink into the ground, it'll head downhill. And downhill, as we often find, is Melbourne CBD. So in terms of drought, drought obviously is a lack of water, which we'll soon look at too much water in a minute. But what we really want to do is create soil that holds water, create a microclimate that holds water, and all that green space holds water really, really well. When you get really good soil structure, because it's got all these natural fungi and microbes and all these things going on in the soil in itself is a living system that actually holds the moisture better than just mulching alone or putting up a shade sail or something like that. So anything you can do to improve your soil and to increase your plant cover helps moisture with moisture retention. A lot of people think that, oh, well, if I have a tree, it's going to suck up all the water. Isn't that going to make droughts worse? Well, no, because what you're doing when you're putting in all this green space is you're actually encouraging more water to stay within a cycle. You're creating that microclimate and that localized water cycle that's otherwise lost from lack of vegetation. So, of course, you want to cover your soil. Just check my next slide that I haven't gone too far. You want to cover your soil. So, bare soil, obviously, as you can see on the right, bare soil dries out very, very quickly because bare soil is not healthy. Bare soil is easily damaged by the sun and by all the other elements, whereas covered soil, whether that's covered in plants or covered in mulch, it's self-sustaining. So it holds the moisture in there a lot better. And you want to think about your plant selection. A lot of people want to build or plant a drought-proof garden by looking to, Arizona and saying, okay, well, let's just put in all cactuses. Um, Good and well, yeah, they'll survive drought, but what else do they offer? Like, yes, you can eat some of them, but in terms of habitat, they don't offer much. They don't offer much cooling. They don't offer you a refuge. They don't offer you a microclimate. So when you think about your plant selection, maybe look to the local environment and, there's so many beautiful bits of bushland. Have a look along Maribyrnong River and just see what nature designed that's beautiful and self-sustaining. And you might find some patches don't really suffer at all during drought because they've evolved with this climate for thousands and thousands of years. So look at your local plants, look at your local indigenous plants, and create some microclimates that are quite drought resistant just using native plants. But yeah, definitely need to cover your soil. That's one of the keys. Another thing with drought too is we can potentially use a lot of water, and that's not ideal. My perfect garden is a garden that you never have to water. In fact, I don't have anywhere in the garden that I do any watering unless I've just put in a new tree and the wrong time of year and I'm giving it a bit of love. Um, but you can think about, in terms of water conservation, obviously, if you've got a veggie patch that's not like my veggies, I grow in a fairly shady spot, they don't dry out. But if you've got a veggie patch in quite a hot spot, cover your soil, like keep the mulch with your straw, your pea straw, that type of thing, to reduce the amount of water you need to give them. And if you can capture some water on site to use, that's fantastic, because a heck of a lot of energy goes into capturing, processing, and moving water through pipes around the city. But you don't want to capture so much water on site that you're actually interrupting natural flows. So the environment needs a certain amount of water as well. Local rivers, you hear about it with the Murray-Darling Basin all the time. The rivers run dry because the farmers are using all the water. So again, it's about finding that balance. Capture just what you need, but not more than you need to keep the environmental flows happening. And you want to minimize your evaporation. So if you do have a water feature or even just a bird bath, think about your positioning of it so that it's got some shade to minimize evaporation, or putting in some native water plants like milfoil can prevent evaporation. But you also want to prevent stagnancy, because with climate change comes mosquito-borne diseases, which are traveling further and further south. So we don't want to encourage mozzies, although the bats love to eat them. So, you want to make sure you've got lots of bats in your garden before you breed lots of mozzies. So have that water moving, have a little solar pump or something in there so that it's not stagnant. Another good tip for conserving water is group your plants according to the water needs. So I wouldn't be having, spinach at one end of the garden, and then tomatoes in the middle, and then growing beetroots down the other end, so that I'm having to water way down there and in the middle and way down there, and then have things that don't need watering in between, because you end up using a lot more water. If you have them all in the one kind of broader area, you're only ever having to water that one broader area. So group plants according to water needs. Don't put drought tolerant plants with thirsty plants. And I can't drum in enough about covering your soil. I do get asked a lot then about wicking beds. So wicking beds, instead of watering the top of your veggie patch, a wicking bed is kind of like an above ground veggie patch where you've got a pipe. So you basically pour water into the pipe that you can see going vertically up the side. The water goes into the gravel at the bottom, and you don't have to use gravel. You could use wine corks, for example. And so it's up to the plants to make the effort. I sound like a mum. Make the effort to grow your roots really deep, to use that water that's deep in the soil. That water, therefore, is nice and cool. It's not evaporating. So it's a really efficient use of water. You don't need much water in a wicking bed. And so the sort of premise is that water wicks up through the soil because the plants use their roots to draw that water up through the soil. And of course, you don't want to overwater it, because then you'll waterlog the bottom. So that's a very nutshell view of a wicking bed, but it's one great way, especially on smaller blocks, or if you're just not sure what your soil quality is and you want to grow some food, you could start a wicking bed. Any raised garden bed, you could do a wicking bed. It's really just about having a well-draining material, such as scoria or corks, around a pipe, and you're just putting the water straight into the pipe rather than on the surface. And I'll show you rain gardens as well shortly. In terms of fire, I know, most people come along to these sessions and say, oh, but I live in the suburbs, fire isn't an issue. Gosh, I remember back to my teenage years when most of Canberra caught fire, mostly because of the wooden paling fences. Like, paling fences are one of your biggest fire threats because they're not living. So a living vegetation is a lot less fire prone than dead vegetation, such as a timber fence. So there is a lot you can do to protect yourself against ember attack. So there is a lot of bushland around Melbourne still, and if you did get fire, even thinking back to Black Saturday, like, people were still getting embers. In like Maribyrnong area, embers will travel that far. So by planting a fire break, particularly if you were, perhaps you back onto a bushland reserve, by planting the right species between your house and the reserve, you can actually really protect your house and your vegetation from fire. I won't go into it in great detail today, because it's a whole nother topic, but I've got a plant here. During questions, I'll go and grab a sprig off it, called Boobiella, which is a native coastal plant, very, very fire resistant, and I've got a hedge of it right where my fire front would come through if we had a fire through. So what happens if you plant some of these low fire species, and most of them are local species, a lot of wattles are very fire resistant. If there are embers coming in from a fire in the greater Melbourne area, those embers will land in that vegetation and burn out rather than continue on and, roll into fine fuels right up at your windows and take off. So, but the main thing is the more vegetation you can keep in the ground, you're keeping a high moisture content. So it's called fire moisture content or fuel moisture content. You want a moist environment. So you don't want to be regularly burning your garden or a bushland reserve or anything else. You want water, moisture to build up through mulches and through plants and that type of thing. And that gives you the greatest resilience for fires coming through if you've planted the right plants. And because you don't hear about garden bed fires, you hear about grass fires because grass dries out very, very quickly, whereas a garden bed full of lush plants and mulch doesn't dry out very quickly. So when a fire gets to a nice moist environment, it'll tend to smolder and can be pulled up, whereas in dry grass, it'll just keep going. So there's a really good list. This presentation will be sent out to you, but down the bottom, the link here, the apsvic.org.au, fire resistant plants. If you do back onto a bushland reserve or it's just something that particularly interests you, you can have a look at a lot of the local indigenous plant species that can give you some quite good protection against ember attack. And just a disclaimer on that, I'm not saying that a particular plant can stop a bushfire in its tracks. It's about making your garden resilient to ember attacks, so being able to catch embers rather than just catch a light. Okay, so deluge. Hopefully we're not going to go over time. No, we're looking pretty good. So with deluge, what we're finding and what we've certainly witnessed in the last couple of weeks is we might get less rain, but when it does come, oh gee, a lot comes at once. So it's about creating a garden that can handle a lot of deluge and not just have it all run off. So the more concrete and hard surfaces we have, the more issues we have because our stormwater drains get overloaded far too quickly. So having permeable surfaces, even if it's just a lawn, everything like that helps. What happens though with these deluge events is everything washes off the surface. So we want really like a really rich soil environment where we've got really good fungal activity in the soil and really good roots, plant roots, because that holds it all together and it stops you just losing all your topsoil and all your seed banks and everything else. And as we've seen through the storms in the last couple of weeks, tree loss, the number of trees that have just tipped over straight out of the ground because the soil becomes just so saturated, the trees just lose stability. There's only so much we can do about that because we do need the water to absorb into the soil. There's nowhere else for it to go other than to clog up stormwater systems and flood creeks. It's going to happen, but there might be some things that you can do around your garden to, I guess, encourage your trees and larger plants to, develop as strong roots as they can, just to perhaps minimize how many just fall over through that environment. I've got a tree that I've noticed, it was on a bit of an angle, and I thought, oh, that's a bit strange. I'm sure that tree's changed shape. And so I've gone up and to have a feel, and it's so loose in the ground, and it's because we're on sandy soil here, and it's in a fairly sandy patch of soil with just kind of a bit of scattered grass around it, because I've just not had time to get mulch delivered. And I know if I'd had mulch delivered and then got my other plants in and got roots in, that would have used up some of that water, but just given that tree a better chance. So that tree is going to fall now. So think about, again, creating that microclimate in your soil to give your soil that better chance of holding everything together. So we want to improve infiltration. We also, I suppose one of the issues with a lot of the trees falling over is the water's going very quickly just into the surface where the roots are and not going beyond. And that's because soil becomes very compacted. That's a whole nother topic as well. But thinking on a local level, how can you improve water just seeping into the soil rather than running off? And one of the ways you can do that is by increasing ponding. I'll show you a picture in just a tick. Increasing your permeable surfaces. So again, a gravel driveway is obviously going to be more effective at that than a concrete or bitumen driveway. And you might do a bit of harvesting and retention so that during those deluge events, that's when you capture your water, and during drought, you open up your downpipe again so that that water's flowing into the environment. So in terms of increasing ponding, as you know, with water, um, gravity, it follows gravity, goes downhill. So downhill is usually through your stormwater pipes to the local creek. But things that you can do on site might be something like building a dry creek bed. So you can see here, very slight slope of land, not even steep, but by digging out that little culvert and putting in some gravel, that then captures the water. So instead of just running really fast off across the lawn onto the road, flooding the local area, it's capturing in that dry creek bed, which certain times of the year won't be dry. And that then gives it a chance to seep not only into the soil, but deeper into the soil, not just at the soil surface. So just again, think of some ways that you can perhaps encourage water flow to slow down, so that it's not racing across the ground, and yeah, slowing it down to how it would in nature. Because in nature, you'll have wallabies scratching and all sorts of things. So you'll have all lots of divots and culverts and trees down and logs down, all these things that just capture and slow everything. And of course, with all our perfect lawns and perfectly flat surfaces, we've really interrupted those natural flows. So I can't stress enough about the permeable surfaces. That really helps. It's called WSUD, Water Sensitive Urban Design. So it's just about planning that long-term stormwater resilience, looking at the flow and how we can slow the flow. So one way, again, very similar to a wicking bed, is a rain garden. So rather than you watering it, you stick it under your downpipe. So it just gets flooded when there's deluge, but you plant plants that can handle being flooded, but you don't have to water the rest of the year. And the concept of this one is that water then seeps down through the bottom and then behaves a bit like a wicking bed. So these are rain gardens on the side of the road where, when you do have deluge, these are obviously, you can see just from the gutter on the right-hand side there, they're spots that would normally have flooded, and lawn doesn't absorb water nearly as quickly as a rain garden. So what they've done is created a depression here. They do have an overflow pipe, so if the water level gets above a certain level, it will flow into the pipe, but it just really prevents a lot of flooding. See a lot of these around libraries, and car parks and things like that. And again, it's just to direction and slow that flow, like that culvert we just saw. So in terms of a productive garden, we want to look at biomimicry. So just following natural systems, as I've mentioned with the culverts and branches down and everything else. What did nature have in plan before we came along and disrupted it? What can we restore? How did food grow before we came and industrialized the food system? Can we use, sustainable materials and things like that don't have such a big environmental impact? So it's about thinking about the materials that you use as well as the garden long term, how much you can mimic nature. And the best way to mimic nature is just to look at natural systems such as a forest environment where you have a canopy. So you have something over the top that causes shade, you have various layers in the middle, and you have a ground layer. So rather than having trees on a lawn, think about having those understory species and all those things that give you that better resilience against the heat waves, against the flood, that give the soil better drainage because the soil's in better condition. So just following nature's design and thinking, well, what does it look like out in the bush? Or how can we replicate some of those concepts? It doesn't have to look like the bush. It's about taking those concepts and applying them to a formal garden design. So some of the things that we look at when we're designing a garden to be productive is again, we're looking at microclimates and things, but maybe on the hotter side, that side of the garden where it does get the sun, taking advantage of that for growing your fruit trees and all that type of thing. So you might be creating a microclimate of shade using citrus trees. So they might create your wall. In fact, I think citrus trees are fairly fire resilient as well. So you're kind of ticking a lot of different boxes and you get food with it. So another really important one is seed saving. Something that happens in nature, as you would know, is plants go to flower and fruit and seed, and those seeds drop where the plant is if an animal doesn't eat them, and then they regrow. And so every generation, those seeds are better and better adapted to that local environment. That works for food plants as well. So tomatoes, I'm sure many people here have captured or saved tomato seeds from the previous season and planted them the next season. By the third or fourth season, you have the best bumper tomatoes ever because each season they adapt. And so it's about taking those principles of nature and applying them for a productive garden. So definitely saving your seeds is really important for that respect. But also choosing plants that you will eat. Like if you're growing food plants, don't just plant something that because you know it will grow well there. Like if it's not something you eat, then you might as well plant a habitat plant. So make sure it's useful for you as well. And just in terms of aspect, again, just to reiterate for those that maybe aren't as experienced with gardening, is on the north, you tend to get the hotter sun. On the south, it tends to be sheltered from the sun. In fact, sometimes on the south, you'll never see the sun. But get a feel for when you get your late summer breezes versus your very drying winds versus your icy, frosty winter winds. And just take all of that into consideration when you're planning what fruit trees to put where, what veggies to put where to build refuges, where to maybe plant out a bit of a wall, a bit of a windbreak. Consider all those things. And every block's different because you've got lots of different local influences. You might be next to a two-story house that blocks those horrible cold winds. So yeah, get to know your block and take into consideration all of those elements of aspect, not just your north and south. In terms of your plant selection, I like to make sure that my plants tick 3 boxes. So when I'm choosing a plant for the garden, I ask what habitat value does it have? Am I going to go and plant a cactus because it's climate resilient, but it doesn't offer any habitat value for local honeyeaters or the local koalas or anything else? So what habitat value does it have? Is it something I can eat as well? Great with bush tucker. I tick both those boxes with bush tucker, but often just regular plants like I've got lots of daisies and things out there that help support the pollinators, and little lizards live in amongst that. So there's habitat value and they work well with food value because they support the pollinators that then pollinate the food. And of course, they're quite climate resilient. So they're the sort of my 3 criteria when I'm looking at a plant and sort of think, does it just tick one of them or does it kind of cover all 3 or does it tick more than one? Because ones that tick multiple ones, especially in a small garden, obviously it's good bang for buck. I think about the water needs too, so I tend not to plant a really thirsty tree. I would sooner plant, say, a eucalypt than a plane tree or an oak or an elm tree, because oaks and elms and plane trees, they don't offer anything for habitat. They offer lots for allergies. They don't offer anything for food, and they don't offer anything for climate resilience. So they don't tick any boxes. Whereas a eucalypt offers climate resilience and habitat value, and to a certain point, food value. If you really wanted to capture the nectar. So at least it ticks 2 of the boxes. So when you're choosing a plant, you can actually weigh them up and go, okay, well, I've got these 2 plants. This one doesn't tick any boxes. This one ticks 1 or this one ticks 2. I'll choose this one. So, and then my other consideration is how weedy it is, because I live near bushland, so I don't want things to spread into bushland and do damage. So I think about things like little blue wrens and, you know, obviously where I am there's koalas, but owls and possums and gliders and bats and all sorts of things. But then on top of that, I think about things like climate refuge. Palms and things are really nice when it's really hot. It's just, I don't know, maybe it's psychological that it's tropical, but banana palms, gee, they tick a lot of boxes because they grow bananas and they give you the palmy feel, and they're quite climate resilient. So, um, you know, have a think about some of the different food plants, and if you're really splitting hairs over which food plant to plant, you might find that one's more climate resilient or one offers more habitat than another, and that'll help you choose. Of course, I think about heat and frost as well. Frost probably getting less and less over the years, but with climate change, we may at times get more extreme frosts because of the way the ocean currents are shifting, and it'll suddenly bring in a jet stream that we wouldn't have normally had because of the disruption. So climate change doesn't just mean hotter all the time everywhere. It really is about the destabilization. I think too about whether or not it's deciduous. I would never plant something deciduous where the leaves are going to drop into a natural waterway or storm water drain, because that nutrient load then kills all the macroinvertebrates that then the platypuses feed on. But really close to the house is a great spot because it's giving you nice shady area during summer, and protection. Oh, sorry, shade during summer and sun during winter. Um, so yeah, I've pretty much sort of covered all of these sort of areas of cultivation. I just keep coming back to bananas because it blows my mind. I drive around the suburbs of Melbourne and see these incredible banana crops. I just think, how does this happen in such a temperate environment? And as time goes on with climate change, maybe they'll do even better. But something like bananas grows so well down here. So think about having a productive edible garden. You might be able to tick both boxes in the one garden, and create your microclimate or refuge in your food garden. And yeah, definitely thinking about diversity. Of course, there's reduced emissions of production because you're growing something yourself. You're not using all the petrochemical resources on it. You're getting better food security. You're more resilient. Things like bananas don't really burn. So there's all these amazing factors when you're starting to look at cultivating your garden. And then two other factors that I haven't covered in today's session, but you definitely need to consider, is whether or not you maybe want to keep chooks for food security. And if so, where are you going to put them? Because they become very heat stressed, but they need sun. So again, you need to think through all these microclimate things in terms of positioning your chooks. And of course, composting is really about supporting your soil and reducing your emissions. So, and of course, you're halving your amount of waste, because about half of what we throw to landfill, Melbourne as a population, is stuff that could have been composted. That creates a lot of methane, which then accelerates climate change. So it's about, you know, mitigating climate change as well as improving our soil. And of course, it's such an amazing catalyst for gardening, because it, you know, once you're composting and you get that first tomato pop up, suddenly, you know, suddenly you become a tomato grower where you never were going to be before. So, so with that said, I'm going to unshare so that we can take your questions. And yes, I appreciate it's a lot to cover in 1 hour. So it's all very high level, but it's about taking those concepts and applying them in your situation. But we have 5 or 6 minutes, so hopefully we can answer questions in a bit of detail. And any that we don't have time for, I'm happy to sort of send through answers later on.
Thanks, Ella. That was so fascinating and just so much helpful and detailed information. Yeah, which I hope was inspiring for everyone. So I see Fiona needs to go now. Thanks for joining us, Fiona. If anyone has any other questions, please type them in the chat now. Ella, I actually had a couple of questions that popped into mind during your presentation. So you mentioned about wooden fencing being a possible fire risk. Are there any alternatives that you would recommend?
Um, in a perfect world, we wouldn't even have fences because wildlife movement, but we have cats and dogs and things like that. So, wire fences are probably a lower impact option. Um, yeah, in terms of fire, I mean, even wire fences can still capture a lot of debris, so there's not a great deal of choice. Metal and brick fences use a lot of resources, so yeah, it's just kind of one of those necessary evils unless we're gonna get really savvy with cyclone fences all around our property.
Got it.
Yeah, but it's just something to keep in mind because people are very quick to blame bushland without actually thinking of the bigger picture. I think
Yeah.
if our bushland is really moist and how nature designed it to be, it's actually fairly resilient. So, to a point, like with climate change, obviously that's a whole nother spanner in the works that's suddenly drying out areas that should have never dried out before. But yeah, it's just an interesting point. If there is a fire, and if you're in Greater Melbourne and there is a fire in Greater Melbourne and you're getting ember attack on your house, you don't have to just think about your gutters and everything else. There's so many things that you need to consider. So yeah.
Keep your eye on. Yeah, thanks for that. Catherine has a question. My backyard is a lawn that slopes down to a garden bed. Would you recommend a rain garden between the lawn and the garden bed?
Yeah, 100%. That's an awesome spot for a rain garden. So, and you can do just like a dry creek bed. So just digging a bit of a culvert. You might want to put in some hard edging just to make it easier to stop your lawn growing down into the culvert. Unless you don't mind a really messy garden, like there's no huge issue if you have a culvert that's just chock full of grass and stuff. Like as far as nature's concerned, she's happy with that. But depending on where you live, that could be a snake risk and so forth. So yeah, putting in a hard edge can just help to control that and keep it nice and neat. We like neat gardens, don't we? How wide should it be and how deep? How long's a piece of string? Depends on the size of your garden. So if I was having a culvert between a lawn and a garden bed, can you see? Like I about probably 80 centimeters. Like it doesn't have to be massive, but if it's 20 centimeters or 30 centimeters, it's not really enough. So you want it to kind of it'll just look right. So you want it to be visually appealing as well and not look really jarring by being really narrow. You can have it really deep, really wide too. And I'd probably have it half as deep as it is wide. So say it's 80 centimeters wide, be like 40 centimeters deep.
Thank you. That sounds great. Thank you. I do have a fair bit of lawn before the garden bed, so I think I could go a bit bigger.
Go bigger. Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. Like I could put one here that's like we're on a slope here, and yeah, I've got some that I've got planned that are gonna be small, but I've got one patch that I'm thinking of putting in like a 5-meter culvert. So no, I get it. Depends on your block.
Ella Anne Marie has a question. I'm looking at putting in a few raised garden beds to grow veggies. Would you recommend a wicking system? I assume there's a bit of additional cost to set it up.
I would recommend a wicking system in terms of your climate resilience. The cost doesn't have to be much more if you go to sort of a tip shop or a secondhand, like a junkyard shop, because you really just need some polypipe. You could even use what do my parents call it, Aggie pipes, so the black with the slots in it. It's sort of like a bit of a tube. You just want something that you can get the water down into the bottom area. And again, you don't have to buy gravel, but you'll pick gravel up pretty much free off, Facebook Marketplace or something like that. Wine corks are really easy to come by because we're the only people that collect them for recycling now, and we're mostly using them in trials for different gardening applications. So you'll easily get wine corks, but you need to weigh them down because they will float if they get wet. And then just some like some fabric, whether you want to use some jute or like a geo fabric, a bit like a weed mat or something like that, just to stop your soil running down into your well draining area. So you can do that for next to nothing if you shop around and get secondhand. But failing that, just make sure you use a lot of sort of pea straw or sugarcane mulch or something like that, and a lot of compost. So make sure your soil is really, really rich in organic material and really well mulched. That's kind of your backup, which can be just as expensive as a wicking bed. Because from a biosecurity perspective, you know, we want to make sure you're getting your soil and your compost and your pea straw and everything from a reputable source so that you're not introducing diseases and other things to your garden. So it's a bit of a catch-22. Yeah.
Awesome. And one final question, perhaps. What are you planting in your veggie patch right now that maybe some other people can get inspired by?
I have a 4-year-old that is cucumber obsessed. So it is cucumbers, cucumbers, cucumbers. If I could plant ham plants, it would be ham plants and cucumbers. Excuse me. Yeah, so at the moment we're just planting cucumbers, strawberries and lettuce because she's the world's fussiest eater. So, and if she's involved, then she will hopefully eat it. So yeah, again, you plant what your family will eat. There's no point growing pumpkins if no one eats pumpkins. But this time of year, so it's been a very cold, late, wet spring. It's going to be a fairly cool summer, so it's going to be a good summer for your leafy greens. It's probably not going to be quite as good a summer for fruiting things. Fruiting things need a lot of sun. But yeah, so I will end up supplementing with a lot of leafy greens for my sake. Yeah. Oh, and cherry tomatoes too, or the grape shaped cherry tomatoes. We do a lot of heirloom plants from various sources because it's just so much fun with all the colours.
Awesome. Lots of inspiration.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ella. That was, such a wonderful presentation. Catherine is chiming in saying the same thing. Thank you for the great presentation. Really appreciate your time and sharing of knowledge today for this Global Learning Festival event. So thanks everyone for joining. We hope that you've enjoyed it.